Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the House of Kayfabe here on YouTube. It is time. It's that time of year where we look back on the year 2022. My name is Adam Harris. Happy to be with you once again here in the House of Kayfabe with Stephen P. New, the greatest lawyer of all time. Also joined by the other Steve Barker, Junk Drummer TV. Check him out on YouTube. And the only Derek Jones that matters. We've talked about our favorite matches of the year. We've also done an awesome piece on our top stories, the biggest stories of 2022. But this time, gentlemen, we're going to look back in a somewhat somber but celebratory, no doubt, way. We're going to look back on some of the biggest passings, the most notable losses in the world of professional wrestling. And anytime a superstar passes away, you know, it hits the community in a weird way and everybody reacts differently. And I think, you know, whether it's expected or unexpected, you know, when you hear that news, it always shocks you. I remember when I heard Bobby Heenan had passed away and I literally got sick. Like I couldn't eat my dinner. We were getting ready to set up for dinner and it came up on my phone and I was like, oh God. And my wife's like, what's wrong? You just went pale. You know what I mean? And I literally, like, I couldn't eat my dinner because Bobby the Brain Heenan had passed away. And I got to admit, guys, it was kind of the same way with a couple of the people who passed away this year. Lots of notables that passed away, some referees, a few legends of women's wrestling. But guys, one that passed away, and I think it's making more news now since we had a huge match last night in Japan, but the passing of Antonio Inoki. For those of us who've only been watching wrestling a little while, you may not know who Antonio Inoki is, but it would be hard to do a video as short as the one we're doing today and explain all of what Antonio Inoki did. Derek, do you want to take the lead on this one as far as Antonio Inoki goes?
Man, he's a true pioneer of the industry, especially in Japan. He's the truest form of a superhero to them would be Antonio Inoki for not just wrestling fans, but their culture over there, because wrestling translates a lot different in Japan than it does in the US. And
sure.
And man, that guy, you're not going to find people that don't know Antonio Inoki over there. In the US, you mentioned Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair, and people are like, oh yeah, those are the guys that are professional wrestlers. But Antonio Inoki in Japan is a completely different stratosphere, even compared to them in the US. And speaking of Hogan, you know, if some of you don't know, but you've seen the match of Hogan with the Japanese guy, and it almost looks like he knows how to wrestle a little bit.
Yes.
Like that's Inoki, and that's
love it
carrying Hogan through a wrestling match with those quick transitions and a drop toe hold and coaching him the whole way. Like there's no match where Hogan knows how to work. That just shows the abilities of Inoki, even as a big guy, that it's just, he was so good at what he done. And like I said, as far as being an icon over there, he's second to none.
And my first memories of him are in WCW. You know, they inducted him, or he was a special guest at like Clash of the Champions before. And so as a young fan growing up, I didn't really know what he did, but there was an entire book written about his match with Muhammad Ali.
Yeah.
And which was shown on closed circuit across the country. Vince McMahon heavily involved. Muhammad Ali, apparently, you know, the story, as far as I know it, is got on the plane and suffered blood clots thanks to the bruising he got from the kicks from Antonio Inoki, and that ultimately led to his decline. And it's just this infamous moment in professional sports, in pay-per-view history, in the crossover of mainstream wrestling, America and Japan, a huge moment. And Inoki, like, held office of some sort, you know, like we talk about Jesse Ventura. He's a politician over there, beloved.
Yeah, in Japan, beloved. And if you thought, I was just looking some things up about Inoki. He and Flair, Inoki promoted this show in North Korea. And if you've never listened to those guys talk about what it was like to travel into, wrestle in, and be in communist North Korea in the mid-90s for WCW, you guys need to look that up and watch it.
There's a whole Dark Side of the Ring, right? That's one of the episodes. Yes. It's on that trip.
165,000 one night, 190,000 the second night.
when you're forced to do something, you'll show up.
Some of those
Yeah.
people weren't even wearing handcuffs.
Yeah, for sure. So I have a very special connection with Antonio Inoki, and I think it will hit.
I want to hear
upon
this
what
because Boone
wrestling-
County to Japan to
I know.
Tokyo and Boone
You
County. I
wouldn't
want to hear
think
this.
there, right? It's what I think is a pretty good example of what wrestling does, which is connect us. So I have a long story that we're not going to talk about here, but I grew up with a Japanese step grandmother, and I actually went to high school with my 16 with a step or a half uncle that was 1 year older than me. It's a long story. It involves Marine Corps, but her name was Setsuko, and we called her Sechon. That's what we were told to call her, which I think is maybe grandmother or some name of reverence in the Japanese language. And when she moved here from Okinawa, Japan, when Japanese people go somewhere, they're very like the stereotype of them being thoughtful and nice is absolutely true. And they work really hard to assimilate to the culture that they're moving in. But she brought very few things from her home country. One was the culinary. She was always trying to get me to eat seaweed candy because she knew I was picky. But the thing that she brought from Japan that was going to always be with Sechon was a framed 8x10 of Antonio Inoki and a bunch of VCR tapes of New Japan Wrestling.
No way.
So I grew up going to my grandfather's house, and that was his wife. And she found out I was 12 or 13. She found out I was a wrestling fan. You know, this is when I was watching probably NWA, like the waning days of the NWA. And she turned me on to, and she used to say this in like broken English. She's like, "Oh, Antonio Inoki, most handsome Japanese man. He's so important."
I love it.
This man was part of the Japanese Diet for years. The Diet is their legislature, right? It's their Congress. There was a moment in the early 2000s or maybe the late 90s where Iraq had taken, probably wrongly, a Japanese hostage. They didn't send their president. They didn't send any dignitaries. They sent Antonio Inoki, and he came home with a Japanese, soldier or whatever it was.
Wow.
This is how
Wow.
important Antonio Inoki was. I think that this is one of the best things that Dave Meltzer has done all year. Is he did a really long retrospective on his channel about how important Antonio Inoki is. And I know that Derek Jones is the
I would
other
check that
big-
out.
It's a good one. It's about 2 hours long. Derek Jones is the other big MMA fan around here. Antonio Inoki was the beginning of shoot fights. You know, like when you were talking about the Muhammad Ali fight, Muhammad Ali thought it was a work. Antonio Inoki, because it matters in Japan, because wins and losses matter, Antonio Inoki took it as a shoot. And when he was told by the Nation of Islam that if he put his fists on Muhammad Ali, they would kill him, he laid on his back for 15 rounds and kicked the shit out of Muhammad Ali. He took it seriously. This man was so important. This is how over this guy was. One of the most honorable things that could happen to you as a wrestler is after your match, if Antonio Inoki felt that your match was good enough, he would come over and he would slap the fuck out of you. And that was a mark of pride, right? Antonio Inoki is bigger in Japan than anybody that we have as a wrestler in America.
There is a legendary clip on YouTube I saw it on Twitter when he passed away. And I think it was on like January 1st, 2000, maybe, where fans lined up down the aisle to get in the ring
Get smacked.
and have the
Oh.
shit smacked
Right.
out of them by Antonio Inoki. One by one. It was like a meet and greet, like at WrestleCade,
Right.
except they're all just getting smacked in the face. Okay, I'll take your money now. Thank you. Next, smack.
That's what we should have done with Cesaro.
Yeah, no shit.
Get swung by Cesaro for
People would pay a lot of money for a swing.
$100
Just imagine.
I'd
Right?
pay
If
for
we had to
sure.
set up
And I was watching one on Twitter the other day
tapped out.
when Inoki passed away, and he was so disgusted with guys that couldn't lock up and do what they needed to do. He left his ringside seat and came down and told the referee to make him go home.
Mm-hmm.
And the most infamous shoot fight video, one of the most, is him versus somebody. It's another
the great Antonio.
Legendary.
Antonio.
If you haven't seen it, I presume most of the smartest fans who are watching House of Kayfabe have seen this. But
this is what happens when you fuck around.
Yeah,
and he found out. Because Great Antonio thought that he was going to, because he was a gigantic man. He was a giant, right? He was probably 7 foot tall, 500 pounds.
400 pounds.
And man, in Japan,
he was in charge.
In Japan, and probably even to this day in Japan, because I watched a great Japanese match today. If you don't sell, you're going to pay. And Great Antonio was not selling for Inoki, and Inoki made him sell because he beat the fuck out of that guy. And that's how serious Japan, even to this day, takes the business. Is maybe one of the reasons that I'm kind of attracted to it, because they don't wink at the audience. You know what I mean? Like that's a Japanese match is not a match, it's a fight. We're going to fight tonight. Right. That's what's best about Japanese wrestling. Fucking RIP Sechon. She was so good to me.
Well, do you still have that photo? Do we know where that photo she brought over?
Man, I wish I had it, dude.
Well,
He's most handsome man in Japan.
I love that. I love knowing that, and that she showed you some of her favorite tapes of wrestling, man. What a wonderful memory, and wrestling and family go together, pretty well, don't they?
Yes, they do.
And speaking of, that's a nice lead in to transition, because a few referees we lost this year. We noted Dave Hebner, Mickey J, which Derek Jones brought up, passed away, and then also referee Tim White. And between those three guys, man, you talk about being, front row for some of the most legendary moments. We can't even begin to name the matches that these guys were present for, much less the behind the scenes things that they saw, especially Tim White, who drove Andre the Giant around. I think that's what most of us probably think of him as being. Somehow we all know that, over the years, like we've just found that out over the years, is that these guys were buddies and that he drove Andre around, and what an honor that was. And if you've seen any of the documentary footage of interviews with Tim White, you see how close he was to Andre and how sad he was that Andre had passed away alone with nobody there. And you think about somebody that spent hours upon hours riding with the man.
Months with that guy.
Riding with the boss. Riding with the man that everybody respected, everybody wanted to talk to. What a responsibility Tim White had, man. And then not to mention just getting him to the building, and then, you're going to go referee on pay-per-view tonight. That's not just your only job. You still have your real job of being in the ring.
You got to get Andre to the arena. Then you got a ref. Then you got to get Andre from the arena to the hotel, and he's going to drink 197 beers and 12 bottles of wine.
There's going to be a few requests. Yeah. A few requests. Anything else about the referees?
The thing about Dave Hebner is we can never know how many he reffed, because how long did Earl and Dave do that thing? Yeah. We don't know who we were seeing. Twin Magic. Which man, who wants to tell that story in case someone's young and doesn't know it? The Dave Earl Hebner, that's some Vince McMahon genius. How long has he put that? Who wants to tell that story?
It really is. I didn't know what to think when the $1 Million Man, that angle, $1 Million Man, and Hulk Hogan, how much did you pay for the plastic
surgery?
It was fantastic.
Great stuff. And the referees, man, they just don't get enough credit. We had Aubrey Edwards at the table at WrestleCade this year, man. What a bright personality she is. And just
I got her iced coffee.
A real person, a real person. That's right. She drinks iced coffee like us and you and everybody else does. That's what we all want. If Steve Barker did have that photo of Antonio Inoki from his half Japanese grandma, or
Full
grandma that
Japanese
was
step
half
grandmother.
step half step Japanese, half grandmother. Don West could have sold that photo to anybody.
What a
Don
Yes.
West, the man who just recently, and it was heartbreaking to hear. I was listening to the wrestling news, and they mentioned that it was a lymphoma brain tumor that got Don West at 59 years old. And my father died of a brain tumor, also too young. And when he said 59 years old, I thought, man, what did Don West accomplish in his 59 years? What an icon, called some of the greatest matches in TNA and Impact. But before that, even was a late night pitchman for, was it QVC or Home Shopping Network? I don't know if he was associated with one or the other.
In-home shopping.
In-home shopping in a year that they brought in millions of dollars in sales. And it's hard to imagine in the days of Amazon and online pickups and Uber Eats, man. There was a time when you saw something on television, you had to call a number and you got your credit card out and you read them the numbers and you would buy things like sports cards on the internet. And Don West was one of those guys selling sports cards in the height of the sports card era. Derek Jones.
So Don West took that company before he joined, they were doing like $3 to $5 million a year. And on his exit, they were doing $150 million a year from him selling sports memorabilia, because they did not do sports memorabilia prior to his working there. So that is purely his ability to connect with people. And I say connect with people because I've met him several times. I've met him a couple times when TNA came here. I've been to the Impact Zone. I've been to different shows. I met him again when I went to All In at StarCast. He was there. And
wow.
And he's not just like a guy that's working and he's behind the scenes. Like, I met him in the lobby of the hotel, just walking around with a drink in his hand, talking to wrestling fans because he was a wrestling fan talking about wrestling. He was having more fun than anybody there because he could go anywhere he wanted, obviously, because he's a guest, but he's also a fan that could go and interact with the fans, and no one treated him any differently because it's like, hey, there's Don West. I know that guy. Because that's how he presented himself to you, as just a guy you know.
How great do you think he was as an announcer?
Personally, he's probably a top 3 at the desk for me. Because
with him and Mike Tenay, right? Am I right about
that? Yes, yeah. Him and the Professor Mike Tenay. And he was the original color guy for TNA. One of the great things that Vince Russo actually did for the company and for the wrestling world was he found Don West on that Home Shopping Network and invited him over and pitched him to Jeff Jarrett because they didn't have a color guy at the time. So that, God love Vince Russo for nothing else. If we don't appreciate him for anything else, he brought us Don West.
Even on the wrestling news, they mentioned that this morning in that same obituary that brought a tear to my eye, just knowing that, a brain tumor is something that the smartest people in the world haven't figured out yet. And it hits people that don't deserve it. Anybody out there watching it there's some people out there who have dealt with that sort of cancer. And it's sad because it doesn't matter what you've done in your life, how legendary of an impact you've had. It can baffle the smartest people in the world. And that just goes to show that we don't know, man. Our time is precious here on this earth. And I love all you guys here in the House of Kayfabe, not to get too sentimental. But we all have that same connection with these people. And that's why it's so emotional when we hear about it. And sometimes it takes a little while to set in. And that's how it was for me when I read about probably the most notable passing of this year, which was the bad guy, Scott Hall, a Hall of Famer, member of the NWO, and perhaps one of the greatest intercontinental champions of all time, a participant in the greatest ladder match of all time, from what a lot of people will say at WrestleMania 10. There was another ladder match at SummerSlam a little while after that, another ladder match, some of the greatest matches of all time. Razor Ramon and Scott Hall, a man, and I got this, boys. I hope you'll be able to see a look at this, but this is an old poster, Great American Bash 1987. And just look at that, Blackjack Mulligan, And Sir Oliver Humperdinck working on top. What?
What is
Way
that
down
about?
here in the
In
bottom.
Florida,
Way
they
down here
were.
in the bottom. Big Scott Hall.
Wow,
Man, from
Hulkamania.
1987.
Mulkamania?
Yes, right. You got the Mulkeys on that. I knew Barker would pick up on that. I had to show that off in Don West fashion, in tribute to Don West. Show off a great collectible, but also to show Scott Hall in the earliest days, man. And I will say, in 1991-ish, it was the Diamond Stud on WCW television that I saw for the first time, and never would have thought he'd go on to change the business at that time. Steve P. New, what are your memories of?
Well, before that, and I know that Barker can back this up because AWA was on ESPN in 86, 87, 88. And there was this guy on there who was the spitting image with brown hair and a brown mustache, spitting image of Magnum TA, named Big Scott Hall. And he had kind of the afro mullet, type thing going on. And
Had the fringe vest.
Yeah. And Big Scott Hall, he had just broken into the business in AWA, but you just knew from his size and his athletic ability that he was going to be something. Now, that Diamond Stud character in WCW, then he does a complete 180 and becomes this Vince McMahon almost cartoony type character with Razor Ramon and the over exaggerated accent and all of it, which totally wasn't him at all. But he made that work, and he got that character over in the WWF with, the razors and the purple and yellow and all of that. Arguably one of the greatest WrestleMania matches of all time. And then, of course, he comes out, you know who I am. What you don't know is why I'm here. And that changed the entire wrestling world right there.
Yeah,
he was the one of the outsiders and later the original trio of the NWO. And I didn't watch WCW at that time. I was in college and broke, didn't have cable. But he was the one that could wrestle. I think that it's too much of a meme with Smarks to say that like Shawn Michaels had a great match with a ladder. That's not fair. Go watch that match. Scott Hall holds up.
No,
you know what I mean? That guy could fucking work his ass off.
The ladder didn't cut any promos either. And I just want to say that. You know what I'm saying? Like, Scott Hall is great on camera. When that red light is on, whatever he was saying into the camera was believable. And that wasn't the case with Diesel.
No.
You know what I mean? Like, Diesel was working. He was trying real hard. I bought Scott Hall as the smooth Cuban. He was not going to pay for the soup.
I remember that.
The ladder didn't cut any promos. So say what you want about Shawn Michaels' work rate. It's there, but Derek Jones,
nicknames that he would give people that stuck. He's the guy that gave a lot of those guys their nicknames that stuck with them. And, they were able to make money off of that. The thing that I think I like best about Scott Hall, if you watch the resurrection of Jake the Snake Roberts, Scott Hall, after battling demons, any of us who've ever battled demons of any sorts, it's hard. And just like Adam was talking about, I lost my best friend to leukemia 10 years ago. Cancer absolutely sucks. Any disease process absolutely sucks. And then you've got those of us who have to face our demons. And Scott Hall, it seemed like after many years of it kind of being a joke, the drinking, the demons with alcohol and whatever other substances and things like that. He seemed like in the last few years there with DDP's help that he had finally been able to conquer those demons and have some peace. And anytime that happens, it's a much better obviously, into the story than somebody who succumbs to their demons, and how tragic that is.
Well, that was the worst part, and I want Derek to give us a younger person's perspective on Scott Hall, because I know that he loves him too. That was the worst part, is he had gotten better. You know what I mean? This was complications from an operation, which can happen. It happened to my favorite drummer, Tony Williams. He was a 46-year-old man, went in for a routine operation, and he died. That was the worst part, because like Scott Hall
lived through
if he would have got his shit, like he had his shit together, he could be working with Sean in NXT. And we already have seen how he mentored his son in New Japan. This was a great mind of wrestling, and I think it also highlights how not great Kevin Nash was. People always say that like Kevin Nash was the big one. Scott Hall was the one. Kevin Nash was on his was riding. He was us to Stephen P. New.
That's
you know what I mean? He was riding the coattails of Scott Hall, because NWA would come out and do fucking 5 promos every fucking Monday. And Kevin Nash barely wrestled. Hulk Hogan, when he wrestled, he didn't really wrestle. But when Scott Hall wrestled, he had great matches. Derek, you're the youngest of the bunch here. We know that you are a huge Macho Man Savage fan. You are aware and knowledgeable about the history of this fucking great sport. Derek, tell us about your impressions of Scott Hall.
So, I come from a house divided. I was born into wrestling fans. My mom and her family were actually WWF people, and my dad and his dad were NWA guys to WCW. So I got both sides of the world, and it was pretty great for it. But I wasn't very aware of the Diamond Stud at that time, and too young for Big Scott Hall. But I knew Razor Ramon when those vignettes started. He's like, "Look at my ride." I was like, this guy's pretty cool. But May of '96, I became pretty much a more exclusive WCW viewer when he jumped the barricade in his Canadian tuxedo, sleeves cut off, and he told us, like Steve said, you know who I am, but you don't know why I'm here. And I'm like, that's my guy. I'm used to watching him over here, but this is my guy. He's the greatest non-world champion there has ever and will ever be. He
was never a world champion.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And didn't even hold the AWA belt, right? Like
No,
Right.
he
may have been tag champions. I think he may have been AWA world tags.
definitely.
Several times tag team titles, intercontinental title, TV champion. He's held some gold, but he is the greatest wrestler to have never been a world champion in any promotion he's been in. And all through, the beginning of the NWO, and you said it, he elevated Kevin Nash. He, in my opinion, he's the reason for the 83 weeks. He's the guy that done that.
No question.
Because in the beginning, you watched him for his abilities. At some point, you watched him for the train wreck that he is, and then later on, you watched him for what he could become. And then we talk about all the nicknames he done, everything he provided to the business. And some people say it's the best and worst thing, but guaranteed contracts. Like he gave people a reason to make wrestling a true career because they're going to get paid correctly for it. He developed the Crow character for Sting, essentially. I mean, he
Wait,
done
what?
He's the guy that
He's the guy that looked
Sting
and said,
to be
"Hey,
black and
you
white."
look like the Crow," and it kind of clicked in Steve Borden's head, and he's like, "That's my new kid."
I didn't know that. Did you know that, Adam?
Well, and I have heard that. I didn't know if I believed it or not, but I've heard that. And think about a guy that's there for important parts of the business. One of the most legendary things that happened when he was coming up and Ric Flair was still in WWE, they lost the Ultimate Warrior for a match right before a Survivor Series. And they had to figure out a replacement. And Scott Hall was teaming with Ric Flair, and Macho Man convinced Mr. Perfect to go to the other side. And that ended up being a last-minute main event. But when you think who are they going to put Ric Flair in the ring with as a tag team partner? It was going to be Scott Hall, and that says a lot about where he was in the business. And there's a few terms, and we've talked about this in our favorite tag teams episode. You know, we talked about the Road Warrior pop. There are a few things. The curtain call is another thing that almost all wrestling fans know what you're talking about. And so not only is he involved in that, but then also the spontaneous appearance on Nitro. He's there to, if I'm not mistaken, he zaps Goldberg.
Yeah.
To let
hit Goldberg with the taser.
To let Kevin Nash end the streak, which is another term when we say the streak.
Mhm.
There's a couple, I guess, that we think about, but Goldberg's is one of them. Scott Hall was there in those moments. The ladder match, NWO. He was even, a tag team partner with who were some of his tag team partners? He teamed with Mr. Perfect in the early days.
That's who he had the AWA champ tag team belts with. Yeah.
Yeah, man. You talk
and
about
all those Kevin Nash tag team matches. Now that I went back and watched them all, Scott Hall worked and Kevin Nash came in and did the power bomb.
That's right. That's right. And that's why I said it took me a little while to even process this one, because it was like, the more you think about it, God, those moments that he was a part of. And then also, it was kind of brought up his demons and everything. And earlier we were talking about Cody Rhodes and his matches with Seth Rollins with that injury. It's like you saw how much he loved the business. And I think Scott Hall, man, he loved the business and he gave so much of it of his life to the business for us, and his impact is so huge, legendarily huge. And yet even got worked into storyline for us. They even worked it into a storyline to entertain us fans, him going through addiction. I don't feel great about it. No,
I didn't like it at all. I don't like it when they bring that shit in. I think it's gross. I think it's one of the things that makes wrestling janky to me. They did it with Hawk, the NWE. Right. They tried it with Hangman Adam Page. Derek brought it up and he said the word, and it's the word that too many wrestlers don't think about these days. He was fucking cool. He was cool. You know what I mean? Like one of the better moments in wrestling is when he gets smashed with the Pepsi or whatever, and he just plays it off and he just puts it in his hair and he's like, he was a cool person. You know what I mean? Like Cesaro at the time, in one of those WWE like retrospective documentaries, they were talking about Scott Hall when he was still alive, which is great that, those things were made when he was still around. And Cesaro was like, when I was growing up, just like, who was cooler than Razor Ramon? He was just fucking cool. And you can't teach that. You're either cool or you're not. And Scott Hall was cool no matter what his gimmick was. You know what I mean? And what this really is, and it's why everyone has this somber tone, is what's great about this entertainment that we watch is it enriches you. It connects you with family members. It connects you with friends. And Scott Hall was one of the best at that. I've got a friend who hasn't watched wrestling since the Raw Monday Night Wars, and all he talks about is that time. And when Scott Hall died, he was really affected. He hasn't watched a fucking wrestling match in probably 18 years. And he came into practice. He's in my band, and man, he was really shook up. You know what I mean? Like he's out of the wrestling business, but he was still affected by that guy. And isn't that what we're all trying to do? You know what I mean? We're all trying to make a little mark that when we shuffle off, someone cares enough to remember you. And Scott Hall will never not be remembered. He will always be someone that we talk about. How great is that? As much of a tragedy as it was, he's always going to live. He's got this body of work that made us all feel good and pissed us off and maybe embarrassed us a little bit. But that's what we're all trying to do, man. Adam, that's all we're trying to do.
That's right. That's right. Were you going to say something, Derek?
Well, and so, we talked about Don West a little bit earlier, but the origin of TNA, Scott Hall was one of the first guys to say, hey, I'll come work with you, Jeff, because I want to help these younger guys out. And he went over and jobbed to so many different individuals, put his name on it. Scott Hall was TNA in 2002, left for a little while. He come back later with Kevin Nash as part of the Kings of Wrestling. Like he did a lot of stints through TNA and Impact history and won very little while he was there. Like he just lent his name to the development of a lot of wrestlers that you see and know today. You know, AJ Styles and Christopher Daniels and Joe and all these guys that he worked with to help him, you know, get over.
And rewind a few years, man. He gave Sean Waltman a name, the 1, 2, 3 kid, on one match.
Yeah.
You know, a few important ones leading up to it where the Lightning Kid jobbed out or whatever. But then, oh my God, 1, 2, 3 kid became a gimmick on those just a few seconds in a match.
Moonsault into a weird pin pose and
into a 69 pin pose.
Made a guy's career.
Yeah.
And didn't lose anything. Still a legend. Still, you know, we're still talking about him.
And made X-Pac.
Made him. X-Pac has a career, but it's not the career that he has without him. And
say what you want. X-Pac first.
There you go. Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for sure, man. Well, gosh, man, Scott Hall, oozing machismo, Don White, being parodied on Saturday Night Live by Will Ferrell, the ultimate echelon of pop culture, and of course, some of the referees that we talked about. And the one and only Antonio Inoki here on the House of Kayfabe, looking back on the year that was 2022. Check out our other videos. Thanks for liking. Thanks for subscribing. And thanks for watching another great episode here on the House of Kayfabe for the only Derek Jones that matters, for the other Steve and Stephen P. New for the House of Kayfabe. I'm Adam Harris signing off. Happy 2023.